So welcome everybody to our second Gamify webinar today. So this one is on the use of remote games to foster innovation and will be conducted by Sune, Gudiksen, myself and Kiril. It's maybe you briefly also want to say hello.
Yeah,
so hello.
I'm sorry. Let me start then. I'm Kiril, so I'm also from HMKW, the university where Henning is teaching, and we are involved in this Gamify project. I'm personally involved since June last year, and before that I graduated business psychology from the same university, and yes, I'm excited to be on board since exactly 1 year. Up to you, Sune.
Sorry. Yeah, and I'm Sune Gudiksen. I'm associate professor at Design School Kolding in design and innovation management, and I have used a lot of these play and games for different kind of innovation processes and so on along the way. So yeah, let's jump into it.
And myself, I'm Henning Breuer and professor for business psychology at the University of Applied Sciences for Media, Communication and Management here in Berlin, HMKW, and we're all part of this European consortium named Gamify, and there's a couple of other companies and universities involved. You can see their logos here on our initial screen, and that already brings us to an overview of what we want to talk with you about today on the second slide. So we'll do a first introduction. What does innovation mean in a crisis? Of course, we have this remote aspects, but we also have more profound issues. We will show you several examples of remote games for innovation. We will show you how to develop such games, give you an example of a corporate sustainability innovation game that we're currently developing, and giving you an outlook into ISBIM 2020 to end up with a final discussion. Which brings us to the next slide. Right, so as a short introduction, you're all aware of the current crisis we are experiencing, and globally seen that provokes our ability for radical changes, but at the same time, high uncertainty and need for coordinated, creative responses prevail. So you could figure, well, on every level, it's a time for innovation. In the market-centered, customer-centered kind of view, we can say that new behaviors and new values emerge that probably facilitate new business models emerging for tomorrow. And we have the management view that observes the operational challenge that's kind of evident to rapidly and effectively adopt a remote mindset, while they're also acknowledging that current losses and gains will probably outlast the existing crisis. And again, innovation may be the best vaccination they can have. Which brings us to the next slide. So apart from this operational challenge to adopt a remote mindset, the next slide, please. It brings us to risks in this whole domain. One I would refer to as the risk of the new normal, right? Trying to get back to what has been considered normal for so long and just seeking innovation in a crisis management mode. And we have some juxtaposition here of what it means to be coping, whether to be caring about a common future, which would be our long-term goal. And so we're dealing, if we're coping with a current crisis, we're probably more reactive. We are focusing on measures, focusing on experts, on a more short-term to mid-term perspective, trying to get back to what has been named the new normal, whereas while we're caring for long-term goals, we are probably more prospective, thinking about values. It's a process run by a large diversity of stakeholders and people, and it has a mid to long-term range. And this also brings us to innovation challenges that we will go into now. One associated with the issues of ambidexterity, and the second one with a more sustainable development. And by the way, this discussion about the coping versus caring, I can also paste here in the chat if you want to follow up on that discussion. But I hand over to Sune for the issue of ambidexterity.
Yeah, thank you, Henning. And also please remember, if any questions come up, use the chat. Before we jump into some of these innovation games example and so on, I just want to briefly touch upon this around the innovator's dilemma and organizational ambidexterity. Probably for many of you, this is not really new, but I see some new aspects to it in this crisis situation. So I think it's an interesting way to start. Normally you have with ambidexterity that you have these double-sided thing going on where you have ongoing operations and you have innovations. You have the short term on the left side over here and repeatability, predictability, and you have long-term and chaos and unpredictability on the right side. If we look at this right now in this crisis, how can we actually look into this about resource allocation now? How does that actually looks like in companies? Do we actually see a new kind of innovator's dilemma, a new kind of phase or version, or is this just put on the edge or whatever? Is that also something we see right now? And of course, also where do we actually believe innovation comes from in organizations now, and also with this kind of crisis, and that also means how we can actually address some of these through innovation games. If you look at this one on the top of the slide here, this could be any kind of a normal kind of value cycle where you have launch, you have ramp up, you have exploit, you have reconfigure, and you have disengage. Now there are many kind of these value cycles and so on. This one is from Rita McGrath over here. But what I want to touch upon in this one is especially this reconfigure and disengage. Because what is happening now for many companies is, of course, they have to, in rapid speed, reconfigure and disengage something and move into something new, or they really have to look into this part and how they want to do that. Now, for some companies who only have maybe one value cycle, only one kind of offering, that's particularly difficult for them. But if you also take, you can just see this model on top of the slide is actually the same as the one in the bottom that we used for a mapping or a game at some point, where you also have launch, you have ramp up, you have exploit, you have reconfigure, and you have disengage. If you go to the next slide here in a moment, you can see here, let's imagine here you have a value cycle here that goes from launch to ramp up, to exploit, to reconfigure, to disengage. Then some companies are lucky that they have started up new kind of offerings that they can ramp up quickly and so on, and find ways to do that. For some it's not really possible to do that. But what we see here is kind of like a normal flow, maybe for those really good at working with ambidexterity in an organization, is that you kind of gradually move people to the next kind of value propositions and value cycles until the final man up here, which is sometimes called last man standing. But what we see now is, of course, that these ones up here, it's fairly difficult now, because if you don't have these value propositions ready, you really have to hurry up. So there's nothing really new in the principles around that. It's just that we see a new thing going on here with reconfigure and disengage in the sense that people, organizations have to really find ways either to stay within the same one, which will be really difficult for someone because they really see the declines now, or they have to work sideways and with all the people, all the competences and so on, and try to find ways to quickly ramp up a new one over here. So just to tap into a few examples from Danish companies, some of the interviews and stories and things we see right now in companies. Of course, if you look at examples on the left side here, you can see that we have, of course, like in all other countries, we have these supermarket chains and so on. Normally, a big percentage of people, they go for groceries on the physical stores. But of course, one of them, Bilka here, had to really move fast from the physical stores into what they call Bilka to go, meaning that all the employees here also had to dive directly into this one. So you see these bigger companies and these bigger chains have to adjust and adapt fast. And they also have to develop this competence for the personnel fairly quickly. If you take the one in the bottom here, which is called nemlig.com, then it's a different starting point for them, because they were actually an online store where you could get all the groceries. So they don't have all the physical parts of it, and that they have to downscale and then create new competence development. They already have it. It wasn't a major success, this company, before the crisis, but now they are really getting somewhere, of course, because many people buy from online instead. Now, the interesting part is, of course, what will happen when maybe, we hope, the crisis is soon over. Will people go back to buy groceries in the stores, or will they actually keep on using nemlig.com, for instance, or Bilka to go? Another example is from this small restaurant and inn. This guy in the middle is fairly good at the cooking and making dinner and stuff for people. He is known for doing that, but he also, of course, has had to close the restaurant, or the in-store restaurant in a sense, and then he was kind of really in doubt what to do. So he, of course, also tried to take this takeaway to the next level. And the interesting part is that then for a small, agile company, in this case, a restaurant, maybe you're able to quickly move over to this takeaway. It was possible for him, and he has a success with that, even to the degree that he might think about not having the restaurant even more, but but this is not always possible for a big company who is not that agile and have a lot of people to move. Like in the branches you saw before, they really have to move people quickly. And in the last one here, you can see that you have these companies also. We actually have a postal service, Swedish-Danish postal service, the National Postal Service PostNord, who has suffered for many years, but right now maybe have some more things to do, but they also need to figure out with all these packages and so on, what can they do now? They seem to have some success with this, so get some income from that. But what will they do after the crisis as well? But at least they have been very good at running with this and keeping it going also in this time. So of course I could continue with a lot of examples and so on from Danish companies and so on, but it just tap into this question about how do we actually keep innovation thinking and processes and so on running in a time where people and management might go directly for operations instead. So that's also some of these remote innovation games we have here is actually a chance to do that also in an online setting. So one of the examples we have here is on the left side here. is a game called Business Model Branching. This was also the one you saw before with the branches and so on, how to build up new branches and close down existing one. Now this used to be a physical game, but we are developing it into an online version that might be ready in August for companies also to use. We had some good success with it in the physical edition because it gives management, but also all kind of innovators and developers and so on, and this perspective on how to move around in these branches, sometimes to open up new ones and sometimes to close down existing ones. If we take the example in the middle here, this is another game we are working on right now, which we hope can be ready for the ESPIM conference to test. This is all about, as I said before, the change in customer behaviors, but also the relations we build with the customers. Of course, we saw a lot of things around this also before the crisis, but it just seems to move very quickly now also with the crisis, that we have to think about how can we develop relations with customers in new ways, and how does that also affect the organizing of the things we do behind the lines. So this is also, the game is actually something where you have a lot of, you go through a lot of choices, you have stakeholders, they come with some reactions and so on. So very much a game centered around choices and feedback reactions. And the last one over here is a game we have used a couple of times, which is also, if you saw the webinar before this one, maybe you didn't, but there is a recording if you didn't see it. But I can just briefly say they also mentioned dilemma games and so on. And I believe dilemma games is a very good mean for also online games. So this dilemma game here was all about organizational values. So you run through a number of dilemmas related to organizational values. We also have one more example later on here related to a dilemma format. So just quickly to summarize the examples here a little bit again. The first one, it's all about business model branching. How can we open up new ones and how can we close down existing ones? It's about the learning strategies to handle each stage of these business branches. So how can we move upwards in some of them, and how can we move sideways with some of our competences and so on. If you see the picture down here, you can see some how it might look like in the physical edition, and we hope to be soon able to also show the online version. And there's a lot about the division of the resources, and as I said before with the examples here, you might have to really move the competences quickly from one branch to the new one now, and ramp up quickly some of the new ones. And example number 2, again, all about customer behaviors and customer relations. How can you move through various steps where you develop new types of relations to the customers, and also change the backside of it, the backstage of it in companies and so on, so it becomes the customer first and so on. So look for this at ESPIM if you want to have a go with that one. This one actually based on an interactive PowerPoint, so it's fairly easy to set up, it's fairly easy to use. You can share it in conference calls, any type of calls in Zoom like today and so on. And you jump into specific dilemmas and so on, and it's ready to go. You can just provide new dilemmas and so on into it. This one was all about organizational values and how to actually build up new understandings of these values, and so also create this common understanding of the values in. If I were to just briefly say a little bit about some of the differences I see between offline and online games, I would say that one of the interesting things for me is actually a term I would call turn taking. So in normal situations where you have group dynamics and so on, you sit around tables or whatever, you actually have these chances to discuss and social interactions in a different sense that you have with online games. So if, but you also have the problems in terms of power relations and many people talking, or some people maybe talking more than others, and how can everybody contribute and so on. You have the chance through these kind of turn takings in the online mode to actually steer that a little bit more, so people can actually participate in a different way, and everybody has the chance to participate with something. That's one of the things we are really diving into here, is to examine how to actually use these turn takings also in play and game techniques. How can we actually create a different kind of turn taking also in online modes, so there's a different sense of participation. Yeah, I will give the word back to you, Henning, again.
Hi. Henning, I think your microphone is muted now.
Yeah, okay, I saw it. Okay, thanks. Yeah, next question and last question for today is, how can you develop such a game for a specific innovation challenge? We'll briefly introduce a blueprint how to do that and exemplify that in a game we're currently developing with one of our project partners in the Gamify project, which is Deutsche Telekom, with the T-Gallery and the social engagement department. So basically what we did is we went through this process together with them. Typical 4 stages, some of you may recognize here. So the initial stage, and I will go through that in more detail, is the framing of the challenge and the rough concept, detailing the concept, going into a design and prototyping phase, which brings me to the next slide to show that. So we developed a kind of canvas that you can fill in for designing games for different innovation purposes. First stating the challenge as a how might we question, then thinking about what are the stakeholders of that should be addressed, what are the participants actually playing the game, what's the purpose or the intent of the game, what kind of basic methodology do you want to apply, what kind of game type do you envision, and what kind of game elements do you want to use. These are the initial step, and an example how we filled this in this project you can see on the next slide, which is we started with the innovation challenge. How might we establish, think ahead, and translate into everyday corporate practices the topic of sustainability in its various facets? And that brings us back to the initial discussion. How can we even think beyond the crisis, or how can we address or try to cope with the crisis in ways that also help us to have a positive impact on environmental issues? We identified the main stakeholders. We decided it should be mainly addressing people inside the company. We said it makes sense to have a moderator, and those of you hanging out in these Zoom meetings over the last couple of weeks will have probably learned to understand the value of a good moderation of these sessions. We said, okay, there are certain purposes and topics that are most important for the social engagement group in Deutsche Telekom, associated to the sustainability related issues of circular economy, human rights, digital inclusion, and climate action. We said, okay, how do we want to go about in this game, conveying this content, achieving these goals? We said, okay, we want to facilitate learning, allow interpretation, but also get the participants in an activated mode of ideation and brainstorming new ideas, and transfer broad global sustainability related questions onto the specific workplace and the challenges they're facing everyday life in their work. we had a little thinking around the game type and vision, and came up with some elements that could be useful given such a challenge and such a purpose, including epic meaning scenarios, feedback, role play, learning from others, collective decision making, and storytelling. So these are the typical game design patterns that we are also trying to come up with in the Gamify project. Yeah, and that then brought us to the next slide, which is the basic setup of this CSI game, or Corporate Sustainability Innovation game. And I'll hand over to Kiril to present this.
Thank you, Henning. Yes, so this is an overview of the steps we have now developed for this game, and these are 6 steps. And this is has been now developed as a prototype, which can be shared and played already. We had a session of playing that and testing that. It can be played remotely using slides. So it goes through these 6 steps, and the first one is about imparting knowledge and also assessing the knowledge of the participants in the game about sustainability. And this is a quiz which is supposed to be to engage the participants, to the players, to bring this more playful mood into the session, and yes, also facilitate learning about sustainability, about some of these topics, especially in relation to these 4 domains of sustainability, which we'll go in more detail on the next slide. So after that, we have the closed dilemmas part, which is the second step. And here, the purpose is to create, to sensitize, actually, to sensitize the players, the participants about sustainability, about its importance and its relevance for the company and the daily work of the employees, which brings us to the third step. And the participants in this step, instead of solving dilemmas with just some generic options for resolving them, they come up with their own alternatives to address the dilemmas. And these are dilemmas which are related to sustainability and are in these domains of sustainability, which are common for the telecommunication business in which telecom is operating. After that, after this more creative part, which triggers the creativity of the players and triggers their innovativeness, so to say. So they have to decide how to address the dilemmas in their own way. They are invited to reflect upon their own work and see what kind of dilemmas they have faced in their daily work, considering sustainability. And this is the fourth step, challenge sourcing, where they see what relevant challenges, sustainable challenges, are there for, in relation to their company. And after they identify such challenges, the game proceeds with ideation step, where the participants come up with innovative solutions to these challenges. They go through different playful approaches and ideate, and then and as they collect the points, actually impact investment points throughout the game by solving the quiz questions and by doing these dilemmas. This is evaluated from the perspective of different stakeholders, which are being played by the players. these impact investment points are being invested in the different ideas that the participants come up with in order to choose the best idea for addressing the challenge that has been chosen by the players. And the different solution ideas are being presented with a pitch, and the best solution idea, which received the most points as investments, wins the game. And finally, the participants present it in a interactive way with an advertisement from the future, so to say. And as you can see, there are different cards to facilitate that. So this can be played in person, but it also can be played as we have developed it now in light of the current crisis. It can be as a remote game, and there are different cards like the stakeholder cards, which guide the players to assume the perspectives of different stakeholders. There are the dilemma cards, quiz cards, and there are normative directives cards, which brings us to the next slide. So these normative directives cards have to do with the 4 dimensions of sustainability, which we identified as most relevant and most important for telecom. And these are overarching concerns in relation to sustainability and innovation. Concerns related to circular economy, concerns related to human and digital rights, and concerns about related to climate action. And these concerns or categories of sustainability have been defined, as you can see here on the slide. And also these definitions are also supported with these normative directives cards that I mentioned, which present the different values and goals and pain points that are relevant for a telecom in relation to these 4 domains of sustainability. Now we can go through some of examples from the game just to get an idea how it looks in practice. For example, we can see one question from the quiz, which is just one of 25 we have so far. And there are different number of points that the participants can gain by answering these questions. So this example is about exactly what we are talking now. And in this category of overarching issues related to sustainability. So what is sustainable innovation? And yes, there are 4 options. I can read them, and if someone wants to, maybe you can give an answer of what you think is the correct answer in the chat, while I'm reading them. So the first option is that sustainable innovation is an approach to innovation whose primary goal is to generate a sustainable source of income for organizational stakeholders. The second option is that this is a process that integrates social, environmental, and economic criteria into the development or renewal of products and services, and business models and organizational models. The third option is that these are practices that enhance the competitiveness of a company while also advancing the economic social conditions in the communities in which it operates. And fourth is an innovation approach based on continuous upgrading a product or service in response to the customer demands. So if someone likes, you could suggest the right answer in the chat. This is for 40 points. So this is we give between 10 and 50 points to the participants for a right answer, and this one is one of the more complex questions.
So it's not easy, but volunteers, please. Take your best guess.
Thank you very much. So we have 2 answers. That it's number 2. And on the next slide, we can see if that's the correct. We have one also 3 and all of the above. There's actually 2, yes. What we focus on this game as well is this 3 dimensions of sustainability, which are environmental, economic, and social, and the interplay between these 3 dimensions. So the other answers were more about not so concrete aspects of sustainability, whereas these environmental, economic, and social aspects of innovation are widely accepted. So after such a quiz, when the participants answer a few questions, so basically most of the times this game is supposed to be played by between 6 and 9 players. So after that, we move on to the dilemma and the closed dilemmas, where we have 3 generic options to answer. And here I will read again the dilemma and the 3 options, and I would look forward to your suggestions of what could be a possible solution to this dilemma. This dilemma is called the CEO on the political scene, and it is that so the decision maker player would read this text. You're a member of Telecom's executive board. Recently, the company has a new CEO in charge, and so I would just actually summarize it. That the idea of the dilemma is that the CEO has been very active on the political scene, and the new CEO has been also very active, but he has expressed some controversial statements in the media about some minorities in the country, or he has expressed some support of the far right movement. So the question is, in how far this can be accepted as good practice by the other members of the board. And the player would have these 3 options: to not do anything and not to confront the CEO with about this issue, because he has the right to express his own opinion in the public, or confront the CEO and say that this can damage the reputation of the company, because Telecom is standing for equality and values of open speech, and standing against hate speech in the media. So the player could choose to confront and make an ultimatum, so to say, to the CEO, and say that he will resign if this is not addressed. Or the third option would be to yes, to confront the CEO directly and say that this should stop, and try to solve this problem on a personal level. So if you want, you can give your choice as an answer to this dilemma, but the idea is that the players in the game will assume different roles to assess this answer of the player, coming from the perspective of a customer, or a shareholder, of a NGO representative, or a journalist, as well as a colleague. And these different perspectives would give a very diverse evaluation of the answer, and will give or take away points from the player who is making the decision. So I will present now the next step, which is the open dilemmas, which is on the next slide. And here the participants have the chance to become more creative and come up with their own solutions to the dilemmas. And here, for example, we have an issue where an employee has been making comments on Facebook about the company, complaining that it has not been very beneficial to the sustainability of our planet, although claiming that it's making a lot of effort about it. So this will be a question for the players. How would they address that? How would they, in a creative manner, solve this challenge? And finally, after this open dilemma part, the players are invited to come up with their own challenges, their own dilemmas based on challenges from their own work, as we mentioned before. And then they do an ideation, the ideation section of the game, which we will not be able to present here today, but we will present that also in ISPIM. If you're interested, you can see a walkthrough through the game in 2 weeks in ISPIM. But at the end of the game, the players make a scenario based on this solution that wins the game, which collects the most points when the players invest in the solutions that they have developed, the idea solutions that they've developed. And they create at the end of the game a scenario for how this solution can be presented in the year 2030 in the form of an advertisement. And they have different templates to do that, like in the form of an advertisement as this popular theme as before and after. So before it was, for example, let's say that there were many employees, in the example from the previous dilemma that we presented, many employees which were complaining about the company's sustainability performance. But after, for example, making some training to teach them about what the company is doing about sustainability, the players can explain how this has been changed. It also can be based on if we can go back again to the slide with the different templates. The advertisement can be based on an analogy where the solution is compared to another solution from a different domain, or it could be a testimony, for example, a day in the life storytelling, or it can be a comparative evaluation, comparing the idea that the players have developed with another product or service which is inferior to the ones that supposedly inferior to the ones that they have generated an idea about. So this is like a quick overview of the game. And yes, I will.
We have one question I see here in the chat about it. So that's from Sandra Togon, asking how can we make sure that we do not just generate socially desired responses and kind of making the game irrelevant. I mean, I think what's important to understand is that through these 6 steps, participants are guided through this process, and the winning and losing points is just one element, giving it a bit of a competitive edge in some of the steps. And it's not about a winner or a loser, it's just about gaining better rights to select the final challenge. And that's essentially the key that we had to skip here for time reasons, where you come up where first you learn about these challenges and then transfer them to your own situation in your own workplace, then select a challenge and then create solutions to addressing that challenge. So yeah, I hope that kind of answers the question. And our experience is also that people actually are quite critical in when they evaluate the responses to the dilemma. So they, I don't know, I mean, it's not that they are just running for the best social desirability, but that they, I don't know, really consider these trade-offs, and that a lot of the arguments behind the decision influences how people evaluate the responses.
I want to add that I guess also the element of the stakeholders, role-playing different stakeholders that are related to the challenges brings in different tensions that the player, the decision-making player, has to deal with. So there would be the perspective of the shareholder, but there would be also the perspective of the NGO. So there are different polarities that the decision maker has to deal with, and this makes it not so easy to just make a simple answer which would be more socially acceptable, for example.
Yeah, for instance, we had a pilot test yesterday where one of the answers to the open dilemmas was quite elaborate, but also a little bit complicated. So the stakeholder, having the journalist stakeholder card, said, yeah, it sounds like a perfect answer, but actually it's way too complicated to communicate it to the crowds. So I do not give it a whole bunch of points at this stage, from my point of view, right? So it's kind of also this role playing or focalization that comes into play here. Good, let's move on. So we have also time for the final discussion. All right, okay, so yeah, like we said before, so you will have the chance to experience a whole walkthrough through this game, and also through the one that Sune was presenting before in 2 sessions we have on the 10th of June at the ISBIM conference. For those of you who are not familiar with it, I'll also paste you the links to, which one is that? I hope into the chat. So that's the link to the conference and the link to the 2 special interest groups. One on teaching and coaching innovation, which was kind of originating the driving force behind like really submitting this whole Gamify project and initiating it, and with another special interest group on values-based and sustainable innovation, where we're dealing a lot about these values, cultural issues, and issues of sustainability in innovation management. Right, so please join us if you have the time there. So, and then brings us to the final discussion, I think. I think we have quite a bunch of people in here, so maybe it does make sense to do like at least 2 breakout groups. Lucia, if you can facilitate that for us. And we have 2 questions we want to address. The one is about stakeholder management. So how do you think can companies ensure that innovative ideas of stakeholders can be managed appropriately without having this direct face-to-face interaction? And that you report a little bit about your own experience, about similar challenges and how you deal with them in your organization. Have you experienced new unforeseen challenges due to the crisis? Have you been looking for remote ways to deal with it? And do you think gamification could be a way to solve some of these more tricky and more profound issues of ambidexterity, for instance, of sustainable innovation on the other hand, that we have been talking about? I will just briefly sum up what we discussed in our group. So yeah, one of our colleagues said, okay, the power of games for some part lies in the fact that it can improve authenticity of the participants through the engagement, and through that actually generate more valuable results. On the upside, also we have the potential to motivate people, to create a team spirit by experiencing the team in the game. On the other side, we have to be careful that people might misperceive it as yeah, people are just out for having fun, doing something not serious. And we kind of must avoid the impression of escapism to when we communicate about gamification. So what Karina added to that was that she actually avoids talking about games or gamification in the first place at all, and just applies certain methods for doing certain things in order to avoid the impression of too much playfulness and not enough seriosity about the whole activity.
Yeah, and in our session, it was mostly me also commenting on a few more company stories from Denmark, because I think we had in our breakout session, it doesn't seem we have that many company representatives. So it was fairly short and about a few stories more from Danish companies.
Okay. Okay, so that gives us a few minutes, I think, or actually just 2 minutes for the final discussion. But I think we have a last slide to show also with our contact details. And so if you're interested in more, please go to the gamify.site website or contact us directly. Yeah, so unless there's any final urgent question or issue, I want to thank you all